Well, just full disclosure, I met you in 2003 when I was an intern, a summer intern for the Washington Post, which you owned.
Makes you pretty goddamn old, doesn't it?
Oh, wow. Not quite as old as you,
Yeah.
sir.
No, not. But you're not a kid anymore.
I'm not a kid anymore. We are in a moment when two pillars of the American dream, immigration and higher education, are under attack like never before in our country's modern history. There was a time, which feels both like yesterday and a lifetime ago, when it felt like there was real bipartisan momentum towards providing a path to citizenship for dreamers. That's undocumented young people brought to the US as children and are essentially American in every sense except paperwork. But that momentum is stalled, leaving dreamers in limbo. There are more than 3 million dreamers living in the US, including about 500,000 who are protected by the Obama-era DACA policy. But those who arrived after June 2007 are not eligible. Most younger dreamers are completely undocumented. Now, I don't know if you know this, but more than 100,000 undocumented dreamers graduate from US high schools across the country each year, with no access to federal grants and loans for college. My guest today is someone who has helped more dreamers afford higher education than anyone else, Don Graham. He's the chairman of Graham Holdings, a diversified conglomerate, and the former owner of the Washington Post, where I had my first real job after college. In addition to his business endeavors, Don has a deep passion for education. He spent decades on the board of the District of Columbia College Access Program, which supports higher education for students from low-income families. And more than a decade ago, he co-founded the Dream.us, which is the largest scholarship fund for undocumented students. When I say largest, I mean that Don and his team, led by Gabby Pacheco, one of our early guests in this podcast, has raised nearly $350 million to support more than 11,000 students in achieving their dream of higher education. In other words, more than anyone else I know, Don is responsible for sending more dreamers to college. Now, full disclosure, I've served on the advisory board of the Dream.us since its inception in 2012. Don, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Jose, I'm delighted.
The last time you and I were physically together was just last month in San Francisco for a fundraiser for dreamers.
Right.
This has been, the Dream.us has been a big part of your life. And I remember that was the first time I actually was in the same room with you as you were pitching the Dream.us to potential donors and supporters. And you described in direct and plain terms how cruel this country has been treating dreamers and their families. And the descriptive term you've heard dreamers use to describe themselves is being in this secret prison.
Secret prison.
Can you elaborate on the cruelty in the secret prison?
Sure. You can elaborate 100 times more than me because you have lived the life of an undocumented person. And I always say when talking to an audience of dreamers, I'll never say I understand what you've gone through because I don't understand fully. I hope I understand a little, but I don't understand what they have gone through. But they are, they grow up, and I would say half the households, the children are told right away, we're here illegally, and this is how you have to behave differently. In half the households, our mutual friend Gabby Pacheco being an example, the parents choose not to tell the children that they're here illegally out of fear that the children might tell someone. An 8-year-old hearing that is very likely to tell their best friend. It changes your life in the sense that here is a central fact about you. Often this undocumented students will tell their teachers. Sometimes they don't tell their college counselor, which complicates the process of getting into college, obviously, because when they get to be high school seniors, they're in this impossibly cruel situation that if they go to a low-income school, and of course their families are typically very, very low income, the average student who's won a scholarship from the Dream.us, their family has a family income of $25,000 according to their tax return. which puts them in the 7th percentile of American families. And of course, half of them are lower. So, assuming the school is a low-income school, every other student in the class gets a Pell Grant from the United States government. That is roughly $7,000 a year toward your college tuition. And that's a grant, not a loan, $7,000. Then every other student can borrow for the expenses of tuition, fees, room and board, and living expenses while they attend college. The dreamer can't borrow a cent. And the federal government is the only lender, for the most part, to college students. The only alternative is someone who lends, usually at a very high rate, to undocumented immigrants. But you don't have any alternative. So you cannot get a Pell Grant. You cannot borrow. Third, almost all states give some kind of state scholarship to students who've been high school students in that state for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It varies depending on the state. And only a minority of states make those grants to undocumented people. So far, the other students in the class have federal grants, state grants, federal loans, and possibly other. There are often other scholarship programs from the state or from the universities or whatnot, none of which the dreamer is eligible for unless the state has voted to make them eligible. So California has a handful. A bunch of states have the ones you would predict, but Texas has, Oklahoma has, yeah, and so forth. But then there's also the crucial question of in-state tuition. And I would say, in about 20 states, dreamers have a legal right to in-state tuition. In others, there's no law governing the subject, and it's basically up to the university. And educators are the friends of dreamers. If there's a choice to the university, they typically choose to give them in-state tuition. But not always. And the dreamer doesn't necessarily know that that's available because it's not the law. So, and that's in big states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. But there are roughly 20 places where dreamers do get in-state tuition. In the state of Florida, which has wonderful public colleges, but very high rates for out-of-state tuition. The state legislature just voted last month to take in-state tuition away from the dreamers.
This is in Florida.
Right. So if you want to attend a public college in Florida, it's very low cost, maybe $6,000 or $7,000 a year, lower in the case of two-year colleges. And out-of-state tuition in Florida is on average 4 times in-state tuition. So they took in-state tuition away from undocumented students, and that included students who'd already been enrolled for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. So a junior who had fought their way to 3 years of college with none of the normal help. Their families had paid, they'd paid for it themselves, they'd worked, they'd taken a year's courses and then dropped out and worked and come back and take it. Gone. They cannot get in-state. They have to pay multiples of their previous tuition. Now that's cruel.
Well, listening to you right now, it's amazing. You know, when you started the Dream.us in 2012, you have now become, because of this work, an expert in all the ins and outs.
No, I'm not. I am absolutely not an expert and don't claim to be. I am not, for instance, a lawyer.
Well, yes.
And to understand the status and the challenges facing undocumented people, you really have to understand immigration law.
What I'm getting at is listening to you describe this, and you put this in the context, having been born in 1945.
Yeah.
The life as it is now, and by the way, has been for decades, right? During the Clinton era, the Bush era, the Obama era, Biden, and now here we are with the second Trump era. If you can paint a picture for us, here you are, getting to know this more than a decade ago. What has been the most surprising thing for you that you didn't know then that you know now?
You used the same analogy I did, Jose. You talked about when I went to college in 1962. And I kind of knew, but I hadn't absorbed the fact that in 1962 there were a lot of colleges, important colleges in the South that had never admitted a black student, where black students were banned.
Yeah.
And obviously, in 1962, black people were also banned from hotels, restaurants, restrooms, whatnot, across the South. And as you also correctly said, you can't compare the two situations. No. The ancestors of black people were enslaved. That's certainly not the case with undocumented people. But there is one similarity. Undocumented students are banned today as black students were banned in the 1950s and early 1960s from those two great universities, again, in both cases by action of the state legislature. And undocumented students are banned from all public colleges in Alabama and South Carolina.
Yes.
I believe DACA students are admitted to those two, but in today's high schools, there are no more DACA students. And this does strike me as exceptionally cruel. So a young person growing up in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, looks at in Georgia, they're banned from those two universities and then have to pay out-of-state tuition.
Yes,
if they go
international.
To another international tuition, which is, I think, three times in-state tuition. So remember, their classmates are going at in-state tuition. Their classmates are getting Pell Grants. And their classmates in senior year say to them, well, I'm going to the University of Georgia, where are you going? And the dreamer has to shrug their shoulders and say, well, I'm probably not going to college, or maybe they pretend they're going someplace. I haven't made up my mind. And as you know, and I don't fully know, but I know through the students I've known, the daily insults, the daily indignities that undocumented people face in this country are done through a kind of cruelty that is, on the part of us citizens of the United States, absent-minded. Yeah. We know that there are 11 million undocumented immigrants, and maybe more. The Migration Policy Institute, I think, now uses the number 13, and says that may go up next year. But, and that's the Migration Policy Institute's the closest thing to a neutral in the immigration space, though there are no neutrals, really. And so we know those people are there. We may know a few, but we don't think a lot about them. And they live their lives as Japanese people did when they were interned in World War II, without us thinking a whole lot about them. And the multiple things, in the majority of states, they cannot get a driver's license. And that means anytime they're pulled over. I know one student whose mother was jailed and eventually given a deportation order because another student's mother, the mother of a fellow track team member, rear-ended her. She was stopped at a red light, and the other parent drove into the back of her car and then insisted on calling the police rather than having the two of them take care of it by themselves. The police charged the mother with driving without a license, and they have if they have to drive to get to their job, to get to their kid's school, they have no choice. But so she, and then turned over to the immigration people, and that is wrong. That is cruel.
That is cruel. That is cruel. And again, now the Dream.us has been around. I was at the announcement
at the launch.
At the launch, yes, I remember. How would you describe the accomplishment of the organization during that time?
I'm thrilled to have been part of this. I wish we'd accomplished much more, but I've been in, Jose, as you know, when you came to the Post, I was working on scholarship programs,
Yes.
and I continue to work on scholarship programs for DC public school kids. I'm not some crazy person who thinks that only immigrants deserve help. I know that getting to college and staying in college for many low-income and middle-income Americans is very, very hard. I think that's one of the central things that people are angry about right now. I can say that the Dreamers collectively are the most motivated group of students I ever met.
Yeah.
And you can sort of see why. They have been told, circumstances tell them, and I've met Dreamers who were told by their college counselor, quite many Dreamers, who were told by their college counselor, I'm sorry, you can't go to college. There's no way you can pay for it once they understand the circumstances of the undocumented student's life. Gabby was told that. And Gabby said her reaction was, I'm going to be so good they can't say no. And that not in those words, but that is the reaction of many of these Dreamers. Once they get in, they realize that they have a very special opportunity and they don't want to get out. Before the pandemic, our graduation rate was 79%.
79%.
Yeah, the graduation rate for all students from all colleges in the United States is around 50. And that includes wealthy students, so that, for lower income students, it's below that. But the undocumented students, their GPAs are higher than, they're a little higher than, they're about 3.2 compared to the average college student who has a 2.8. Once they graduated, if they had a work permit, and in the first 5 or 6 years.
A legal work permit.
Yes. In the first 5 or 6 years, everybody had a work permit because they had a status called DACA. Once they graduated, 94% of them got a full-time job, or a handful of them were in grad school after 6 months of graduation.
When I was asking about accomplishments, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're talking about the scholarship fund has enrolled 11,000 students in close to 80 partner colleges that you've worked with, right?
In 20 different states.
In 20 different states. And then when you look at this report and you go to the website of thedream.us, there's a whole report that says that your alumni, among of whom are almost, DACA recipients, of course, are part of that, collectively earning $27.9 billion.
That sounds a little high.
No, you're talking about the DACA population.
Oh, yeah, the DACA population total. Thanks.
Right? Yes. Of which many of whom, of the 11,000 Dreamer scholars that you've had, many of whom are a part of that, 670,000. What you were just referring to is the persistence rate.
Yeah. I think in every one of our 80 partner colleges, our partner colleges typically, as you know, Jose, they are the lowest cost good colleges in a given state. We mostly operate in states where the Dreamers can get in-state tuition, not all. And I would say probably in every one of those partner colleges, the Dreamers have a higher persistence rate than the college as a whole, 80 for 80.
Yeah.
So they want to stay, they want to complete. I mentioned grad school.
I was about to get there, but
in the second year of this program, I was over at Trinity University in Washington, which is a women's college in Washington, D.C., run by a great friend of low-income students, Patricia McGuire, president. And Pat was in a room with me, and she asked a room full of Dreamers, how many of you think you want to go to grad school within 2 or 3 years of graduation? Probably 80% raised their hands. And I said, oh, goodness. This is because I knew that to go to grad school, I don't know that everyone understands this. Graduate school in the United States costs many times what college costs. And,
many times.
Several times, 3, 4 or more. And we send students, for one example that everybody knows, to the City University of New York, which has 11 different four-year colleges. Yeah. The tuition and the cost of attendance, the tuition and fees at all of those colleges is $7,250 a year. And there's no dorms at CUNY, so that's the total cost of attendance. Obviously, you have to get there by subway, which is very expensive. You have to buy books. We give a totally inadequate $1,500 a year stipend to help the students with books and transportation, but that's not even going to pay for subway fare. But $7,250 a year. There are no $7,000 graduate schools in the United States. They are, if you want to go to medical school, with very few exceptions, you can expect to pay $100,000 a year for tuition fees, and they will tell you necessary room and board. You've got to do your work, meet your section mates and whatnot in a dorm. So since the dreamer cannot borrow, they have to beg and hope for a full scholarship to some graduate school. And full scholarships to grad school, it isn't like college.
Yeah.
They are rarer than hen's teeth. And the colleges that proudly say, if we admit you, no matter how poor you are, we'll find a way for you to get grants and loans to attend our college. They don't say that about grad school. And so the grad school is a door that's basically shut. We've been part of a program run by a glorious nonprofit called Social Finance that makes loans to graduate, makes a few loans to graduate dreamers, not with our money, with the money of a bank, on the lending terms of a bank. They lend to DACA students and TPS students because they have work permits. And so we've been able to make some loans for grad school, but not many.
What's occurring to me right now is I remember being with you on the launch date of the scholarship fund, and you saying to me as an offhand comment, I don't know if you remember this part, something along the lines of, we'll do this for a few years and then Congress will solve this and we will be done.
And you say that to me today and it sounds as if I were a crazy person. In 2014, it did not seem crazy to say Congress is on its way to passing the DREAM Act or to passing immigration legislation, and that will make a huge difference to the dreamers. Why? Because in 2013, the Senate, which looked like the more difficult branch of Congress, had passed a comprehensive immigration bill, which would have given some generous things to undocumented students, but would have done much more. In 2012, President Obama had created DACA, and it seemed likely that these would be the case. And I did not anticipate the political direction of the United States the last 10 years. So what I predicted to you and others, or what I guessed to you and others, was flat wrong.
And here you are, more than a decade into this work now. I was saying during the introduction that about 100,000 undocumented students graduate from high school every year.
That's what you might call an educated guess.
An educated guess. Most of them, of course, don't qualify. If not all of them don't qualify for DACA. So now, under the Dream.us, you have students, dreamers, scholars from many different backgrounds. What are you seeing? What is the Dream.us seeing in terms of how are they dealing in this new era, in the Trump era in particular, in terms of going through college, getting a job if you don't have DACA?
The dreamers are, and also their families, are a resource that this country doesn't understand it has. DACA, granted by the result of what was in essence an executive order from President Obama in 2012, it wasn't technically an executive order, but it might as well have been, was a brilliantly designed program which gave to certain students, if you'd come to the United States before your 16th birthday, if you'd come before June 30th, 2007, and if you had no convictions of a felony or a, quote, serious misdemeanor, and the definition of a serious misdemeanor was tough. One DWI, one drunk driving, you were out.
Yep.
Pretty tough. You had to submit your fingerprints and whatnot. And if you got DACA, you got three things. You got freedom from deportation for 2 years while you had DACA, but you could renew your DACA paying $495 each time. I think the price has now gone up.
A little higher, yes.
But each 2 years you had to pay that, and that is a challenging sum for undocumented families, believe me. And you got also, for the same 2 years, a Social Security number, which you could call a temporary Social Security number because you had to renew it every 2 years. It expired with your DACA. And you got a work permit. And the work permit, which an employer would see, with the work permit, you could work for any company in the United States. You could work for Starbucks, you could work for Google, you could work for anyone. You could work for your university, which a lot of students did. Without DACA, you do not have the freedom from deportation. You do not have the work permit.
Yep.
So you cannot work, but there are still things you can do. You can start your own business. You can be a consultant or a contractor for Google, or can't be one of those for Starbucks, I think. But you can contract with a company. Say that the dreamer is a computer science major, and there's a significant number that are. They can set up their own company and do programming for anybody. They can do programming for a company that needs programmers. That's a simple example, but there's plenty of those. But the absence of DACA is an additional cruelty.
So meaning it was already complicated and now it's gotten even more complicated.
Yeah, it's even more complicated. There's one important thing I should have said early. We've given 11,000 scholarships to undocumented students over the last 10 years or more. The average student came to the United States as a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
They entered the United States at that age, which again means half of them were younger than 4 when they came here. And I've met kids who came here as a 2-month-old.
Yeah.
I've met plenty of kids who came here at 1 or 2. And as you know, Jose, I have a lot of sympathy with law enforcement. I favor the enforcement of American laws.
You were a DC cop.
Early in my life, for 1.5 years, I was a police officer in Northeast Washington, D.C., 1969 and 1970, for about 18 months. And I arrested felons, and I brought them to court. If I had arrested a 4-year-old and I brought them into court, the judge would not have gotten mad at the 4-year-old. I think they would have gotten mad at me. But a 4-year-old can't commit a crime. A 4-year-old doesn't have, in law, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, doesn't have a mind that is capable of forming criminal intent. But it is important for everyone to understand that if you enter the United States as a baby, you're not born here. You're carried in by your parents who either overstay a visa or cross the Mexican border illegally. You can never change your status.
You can never change your status.
Yeah. And
people don't understand that.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you know that. And everybody says, well, geez, if you wanted citizenship, you could apply for it. No, you can't.
No, you can't.
Can you pay a fine? No. Is there any path? No. Can you, for example, join the United States Army, which desperately needs soldiers? No, you cannot. Can you display extraordinary merit? And is there, the president, other opponents of immigration often talk about going to a merit-based immigration system. So if you display extraordinary merit, can you become a citizen? There are 2 Rhodes Scholars among the DACA recipients,
Yes.
and they are still undocumented. They cannot.
One of whom, by the way, I remember when Darren Walker at Ford reached out because he was on the considering the Rhodes Scholars, and one of them was an undocumented student from Harvard named Jin Park.
Who won?
And he was associated with Define America and wrote a letter. And so Jin became the first undocumented Rhodes Scholar. And you're absolutely right. He could win the Rhodes Scholarship, and still there was no path to citizenship.
And as you know, Jin then went on to Harvard Medical School and must be an MD by now. And there are more than 200 doctors with DACA. There would be many more, but again, they can't borrow. And there are med schools here from lots and lots of undocumented students every year who are qualified to be doctors, who have the academic record to become doctors, but they can't borrow the money and they can't get a full ride. But there's more than 200 doctors in the United States, MDs. There are thousands of nurses with DACA. They can't alter their status. Badly as we need nurses, badly as many communities.
And many states don't let them actually practice because they need to get some sort
of license.
Of license.
And there's also the question of licensure exams
Yes.
in, I would say, 40 states out of 50. Even if they graduate from college with, say, a nursing degree, a fully undocumented student who doesn't have DACA cannot take the licensure exam because they're undocumented, they don't have a work permit. Now that student, again, could do the work of a nurse. How could they do it if they don't have a work permit? That's easy. The hospitals contract with nurses all the time. They could sign a contract with them. They could set up a private nursing company and treat patients.
Well, what you're describing here, by the way, our exchange just now, and some of this I've shared with you. One of the most difficult things for me after I had come out as undocumented to try to inform people of the complexity and the nuance of what it means to be undocumented is getting fellow journalists to understand what immigration is as a process.
Yeah.
So my question is, having done this work, right, as a journalist, I know you as constitutionally, as former publisher of the Washington Post, the Graham Holdings Company used to own Newsweek. What is your message to journalists, our fellow journalists, about this moment and what must be captured?
There's plenty of exceptions. We happen to be talking on a day when there's two very important immigration stories on the front page of the Washington Post. I'm very proud of those reporters.
There are absolutely exceptions.
Yeah. But, again, if you go back to the time of segregation in this country, reporters in the South weren't getting a lot of calls from black people. They might have been getting a call from civil rights leaders, from ministers, but most black people didn't know anybody at a newspaper and were discouraged from raising their voices, very strongly discouraged, famously. And again, I make no analogy between the condition of black people in the South under segregation and the situation of undocumented immigrants. But everybody in the United States knows, including the bitter opponents of immigration, that there have been millions of undocumented people in this country for many years. But very few of us know those people. Before I started doing this, I knew you, and I knew a handful of other undocumented people that I'd met, mostly because they were advocates, because they were public in the process. But I now realize that undocumented people are everywhere. They're everywhere. In every state in important numbers. Maybe not so many in Alaska or Vermont
or North Dakota, but yes.
Yeah, but there are a lot of dreamers in a lot of undocumented people in a lot of states, and reporters, unless they are exceptional reporters, have no reason to know those people. They aren't politically active. They don't vote. They can't. They don't contribute to politicians because they don't have any money.
And they can't, right? We're not allowed to.
Right, you're not a citizen, so you can't contribute. And
so the proximity, you're saying there isn't much proximity and access to.
If there are reporters, you and I knew reporters at the Post, Pam Constable for one, who went looking who knew tons of undocumented immigrants. You can know them if you care. And a good way to meet them is call the local college and find the people who are the champions of undocumented immigrants. There's sure to be some, except in states where they're banned. And yes, I agree with the tenets of your questions. This is, if there really are, say, 12 million people in the United States, that's 3+% of the population. That's not an overwhelming number, but it's a pretty damn big number. And I would say in most news coverage, their troubles, their problems are ignored. Now, I'm sure people on the other side of this issue would say, "Oh no, they're not. You know, the papers are always right." But we write about the politics of this issue, but we don't write about the daily lives of
and the
undocumented.
process that it takes.
Right.
And you know, as you're talking, one of the things I'm remembering is how you described a few minutes ago the indifference and the ignorance that kind of define the general public's vision of immigration. Just a few days ago in the Washington Post has been breaking stories left and right on this.
Yeah.
Right? Like the IRS, for example, cooperating, big story. But here's what gets interesting, Don. I can't tell you how many journalist friends of mine in the past couple of weeks have reached out saying, "Oh, yeah, you've been talking about how undocumented people pay taxes." And many of them didn't really understand it, didn't believe it, and now, at the same time that we're realizing that yes, undocumented people pay taxes, and yes, the IRS is now going to cooperate with ICE to try to figure out where these people are.
And you can bet that will sharply diminish the number of undocumented people paying taxes, unless undocumented people don't, you know.
Actually, we have an episode about precisely this. We interviewed Francine Lipman, who's like the leading scholar of undocumented workers and the IRS and taxes. So please check that out. But
let me go back to your broad question about media coverage of immigration and immigrants. Again, we have a situation where these people are banned. Let's take the recent dramatic example that Florida's legislature, with no hearings, with no opportunities for dreamers to raise their voice and talk about the consequences of the issue. A Florida state legislator proposed that they ban, that they take away in-state tuition from undocumented students, and claimed that Florida was spending $43 million on this. How did that legislature come up with that number? Yeah. I think, I can tell you. The legislator said, well, if all the students were paying out-of-state tuition, the state would get another $43 million. But almost none of those students can think about affording out-of-state tuition. And if you think about it for a minute, in the Florida media, which did a good job of covering this, said that 6,000 students had availed themselves of the exception afforded to undocumented people. So 6,000 students were paying in-state tuition in Florida. You multiply 6,000 a year times 6,000 students times 4 years. The state was getting more than $20 million a year in revenue to the state colleges from those students. It wasn't costing Florida money, it was earning Florida money. And this legislator came up with this fanciful number, pulled out of the air. And the legislature passed it with Governor DeSantis begging them to, and with apparently President Trump encouraging it, although President Trump has said some very positive words about Dreamers, oddly.
Well, actually, he met with Gabby. I remember when he was first running in 2016, he had a meeting with Gabby.
Let me tell you something with a childhood, a teenage memory. One of the great journalists in Washington, and a great friend of my parents, and a great friend of mine, one of the people I really looked up to in journalism, was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, a man named Scotty Reston, James Reston, who hired all the great reporters in the New York Times bureau in the 60s and 70s. And he once wrote, what the press does worst is cover things that happen slowly. That's a pretty good, so his example was the migration of black people from the South to the North in the 1940s, which had proceeded almost entirely unobserved
which is still to this day the greatest movement of people.
Yeah. The lives of undocumented immigrants came to this country slowly. We thought of it for years as something that was happening in California and Arizona.
Nope. Alabama, Wisconsin, everywhere.
Yeah, and There is no place where it isn't. And Wisconsin, which you mentioned first, does not give in-state tuition to immigrants. Neither does Indiana.
And I would also say, to your point, that there are absolutely exceptional journalists writing for the Washington Post, for the New York Times, for CNN, doing responsible work.
I agree.
However, what's happening now is they fall into the mis and disinformation, right? Like right now, the typical way that a person gets their news, if they can't afford for a Washington Post subscription or New York Times subscription, a lot of them fall on YouTube. A lot of them is on X or Twitter. A lot of them, and the mis and disinformation on this issue is immense.
Well, and I want to add a couple of things here. When President Trump talks about immigrants, before his election and after, he talks about murderers, he talks about gang members, he talks about drug dealers, and there are such people. There are people who have come to the United States and committed terrible crimes. My own feeling is that on immigration, both sides are basically right. That we do not want murderers and people coming to this country to commit murders. We don't want gang leaders coming to this country. We don't want drug dealers coming to this country.
Yeah.
They should be found and they should be deported. I am 100%. We should have a secure southern border with Mexico. We should have a border that is as secure as the border with Canada, and we should do what's necessary to create that. Although I have to say, I say that in total ignorance of what that would take. I've never been to the border. I know, I said earlier, I am not an immigration expert. I'm not a border expert. But when President Trump says we need a secure border with Mexico, I agree. When he says we've got to throw out felons and dangerous people, I agree.
Because there are felons and dangerous people in each population,
and they need a chance to be heard in a court. But if they are indeed this sort of person, they should be deported. On the other hand, when the Democrats say there's a lot of people here who would do this country a lot of good, and it's not just Democrats who say that. There's a lot of Republicans who say that
as well.
And there's a lot of people here who could help this country in a big way, and they're right too. And it is a very hard job for someone to identify people who should be encouraged to stay here and identify people who should not be encouraged to stay here, which is, I think, of quite a small number, but a relatively small number of felons, gang leaders, drug dealers, the kinds of people the president talks about. Fine, the president's right about that.
Well, I'm going to personalize this a little bit as we get into this conversation.
Yes, you certainly can. You have a right to do that.
Well, before the DREAM Act was introduced in 2001, I was a freshman. Going on sophomore year at San Francisco State
University.
You
might say what two senators introduced that.
Bi-partisan DREAM Act was introduced in 2001. Unfortunately, it happened right before 9/11, so it got kind of lost with what was happening with 9/11. I was a student at San Francisco State, and I knew that I wanted to be an intern at the Washington Post, if I could be. I applied, I got in. On the employment form that I had to fill out, I lied on the form. I lied on the form because if I didn't check the U.S. citizen box, it meant that I would not have been eligible. I did not consult a lawyer. I didn't talk to anybody. I lied. And I got the internship. And working here in D.C. as an intern and then later on getting hired as a 2-year intern that ended up being a full-time job, I lived there from 2004 to 2009, just in complete... To be honest, I haven't processed what that was like to not tell anybody. There was one person I told, you know him, Peter Pearl, who had been at the Washington Post for many, many years. He was the only person. And I had so many moments with you, Dawn, because you were supportive of so many young journalists back then. You would write us little notes encouraging us.
Yeah, you and I knew each other pretty well.
Yeah. There were so many moments that I wanted to tell you. And I didn't. And I did it because I knew that once I tell somebody else, I'm now making them a part of this problem that I couldn't solve.
Right.
And I'm bringing this up now to say to you, first of all, I apologize to you privately. I'm now doing it in person.
Thank you.
That I apologize that I had to lie to get the job. And now that there are many dreamers out there out of status with no legal work permit, what is your message to not only those dreamers who are trying to make a living in whatever way they can, but in this moment to employers who are like, what should they do if you were in a situation, for example, that I was in, that I didn't tell you, and if I had told you, I'm not sure what you could have done to help.
Well, if you're asking me what would I have done if you told me back then, the answer is I don't know. I didn't know much about undocumented people back then. And I think we both would agree you were wrong to lie on that form because it put you in a bad place and it put the Washington Post in a bad place.
Yes.
We have to tell the federal government about everyone we hire, and we cannot hire people who are ineligible to be hired in the United States. But we talked about this earlier in the podcast. There are legal ways that an undocumented person can work with an American company. They cannot be an employee as the rest of the employees are. But the simplest way is, I think, I believe in every state, they can start their own business. They can start Jose Vargas LLC. And they can, an employer can sign a contract with Jose Vargas LLC for writing, for programming, for nursing, for teaching. There are people with an education degree who've started their own business as tutors, a now widely needed business. And I don't know if I would have known in 2006 or something that you'd created a problem for both of us, because if someone lied on an employment application, that was an automatic, you're fired. And that was an unbroken record. If I'd known then what I know now about undocumented people, I would have thought very hard about a way to keep you, because I know you're good and I know you were contributing something that others do not. And working as a contractor or starting your own business and working for us and selling your services to us in that way would have. But there's one other important thing. I would have called in our lawyer, Bo Jones, and I would have urged you to work with a lawyer so that we went forward in a way that was legal. But I would urge any dreamers who ever see this podcast, do not lie about your status. Don't submit a phony SSN to someone. Don't say you're a citizen when you're not, because you have one problem, which is your undocumented status, but you give a false number, you're creating a second problem, and it's a pretty big problem.
And what I would add to that is, as much as possible during this time, find as many allies and as many good Samaritans as you can possibly find, who will look at you as a person and who will figure out a way to work with you.
I completely agree. Wherever you live, there are people who understand the situation of undocumented people and work with them. One of the best such people I know lives in Georgia, which is one of the worst states. And I know a dreamer who got herself into a situation in Mississippi where she was detained, and ICE announced she was going to be detained without a hearing. And a great immigration lawyer in Jackson, Mississippi said, "Oh, no, you're not." And she graduated from college and has a graduate degree today.
I think the message here is, the doors may be closed, but there are many windows you can open.
Well, it's true. In a very old-fashioned way, I love this country. I graduated from college in 1966. I was drafted. I served in the U.S. military. We mentioned that I served 1.5 years as a D.C. cop. And I grew up in a family where my dad had been a major in the Air Force in World War II in the Pacific, working in New Guinea and the Philippines. And I grew up knowing what we'd been through in World War II and knowing that we were in a difficult struggle with communism and knowing that, in my opinion, we were right. And I have seen this country not solve, but take steps towards solving other very difficult problems, do things that were right, that looked like a big long shot in 1950. And we will find ways to make the situation of immigrants in this country better. I don't know what those ways will be, but above all, I don't know when. But I think because this country is basically good. I said, when we talked about immigration at the start, I said it's an issue that most Americans don't know much about, are pretty ignorant of. And I think when they fully understand the issue, they will want to see both halves of it addressed.
Well, on behalf of the 11,000 and more scholars of the Dream.us and other undocumented students who want to build lives and careers here, thank you very much for what you've done and what you continue to do. This is now a big part of your legacy.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Jose. I want to say one other thing about those students.
Yeah.
You asked about, have their attitudes changed in this time when there's a different president, when they're in a different situation, they don't have DACA, they know they can't work the same way on graduation that you now can. And the best answer I can give you about their feelings is in 2025, this year, we opened our scholarship application round the 1st of November last year, the days before the election. Nobody fills out their application the day that it opens because you have some work to do to fill it out. And it closed on March 1st. So anybody applying for this scholarship knew that Donald Trump was president and probably heard him say a great deal about his plans for mass deportation and whatnot. We had more applications to college this year than we had last year. There are still just as many ambitious, hardworking, motivated students in American high schools who want careers that will earn money for them, help their families, and help this country as there ever were.
And if you want to support that, go to the Dream.us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks, Jose. Always a pleasure.